Okay, when we're talking about protected areas and corridors and making these networks of protected areas, we also have to think about landscape ecology, which is looking at environmental effects at spatial scales larger than the habitat. So we're thinking more local or regional scales. So how does the area surrounding a protected area affect the effectiveness of that protected area? So traditional landscapes contained a mix of natural areas, sustainable use areas, and villages. So this is an example um, from a traditional landscape in Tokyo. And the black areas are villages. The kind of tan areas are agricultural areas. And then there are some sustainable use areas and some kind of left alone natural areas as well mixed in here. So what do landscapes look like today? So I'm going to show you a couple. We need to think about what are barriers to wildlife movements on our landscapes? What could affect connectivity? How could we change this? So this shows kind of the landscape around Ruston. You can see that there is a lot of forest, but it's kind of fragmented. We have little patches of forest, and then some other types of areas. We have a really big barrier, and that is I-20. But there are other roads that also could be barriers depending on what kind of species we're thinking of. If we zoom out from Ruston, we see some other features, and some of you may be able to recognize what this is right away. This is actually natural gas development. So each one of these are natural gas pads with little roads to them. And this breaks up the forest and breaks up the landscape in ways that might be problematic for conservation. So if we're thinking about connecting protected areas, we need to think about where these types of barriers are and how can we design things so that they're not as much of a problem. Here's a really big barrier. This shows the landscape around Atlanta. I think I mentioned this before, but with climate change, Atlanta is one of the big concerns for biodiversity being able to shift as as the climates are moving north. And Atlanta is near the bottom of the Appalachian Mountains as well. So for some species, they may be needing to move upslope, up into the mountains to maintain their populations with climate change. But Atlanta represents this huge barrier. And so this may not look like a lot of barriers often here, but these are all subdivisions. None of this is really anything but a tiny patch of natural area. This is the top of the panhandle of Texas, and this may not be something that some of you recognize, but some of you may know what these circles are. These are from Center Pivot Agriculture, and so basically this is where irrigation is occurring. So they have a center pivot and there's an arm that sprays water out in order to cultivate crops. And so that's what makes these circles, because the arm goes all the way around the circle to water these different areas for growing crops. This is a different kind of landscape. This shows Yellowstone National Park and the areas around it. And you can see there's a lot less development. Like, we don't see hardly any cities. There are some kind of developed areas in a few places, but there aren't as many like major roads, cities. I mean, there are roads and things in there, but they're not as large of a barrier as we might think of in the Atlanta area. So I'm going to have you watch a video that's on the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, and they'll talk more about the goals of this project. But the idea is to connect the Yukon Territory up here all the way down to Yellowstone to create this large network of reserves to maintain connectivity and to preserve the most biodiversity possible. And it's to accommodate our larger wildlife, but it's going to accommodate a lot of smaller wildlife while it's working on that. And the idea is to be able to maintain the ability for these wildlife species to move between these different protected areas.